In June of 1924, during the second British expedition to climb Mount Everest, two men, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, would begin their final ascent in the aim of reaching the mountain summit. Following a few hundred meters behind Mallory and Irvine, a fellow mountaineer in the expedition, Noel Odell, would take pictures of the two men climbing before Mallory and Irvine entered a thick, misty fog close to the summit, leaving them out of Odell's sight. Mallory and Irvine weren't confirmed to have reached the summit, and they never returned to the base camp, although they most certainly died, as their bodies have been found in the decades since then. The debate on whether the two men completed their ascent to Everest summit still rages on in the mountaineering community. This mysterious episode opens Jiro Taniguchi's Summit of the Gods, a story entrenched in mountaineering. After we are presented with the disappearances of Mallory and Irvine in a documentary-like tone, we are introduced to Fukamachi Makoto, one of the series' two protagonists. He wanders aimlessly around Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal, after his expedition to Everest failed, which left him in a miserable sense of disorientation in his life. He's alone in Nepal, as his fellow expeditioners have returned to Japan, with Fukamachi only staying because of his fear of coming to terms with his loss on Mount Everest, and his hope that he may find something in Nepal that makes his trip seem less pointless. But it's in this isolated walk through Kathmandu that Fukamachi decides to enter an inconspicuous store. Immediately, Fukamachi finds an antique camera that reminds him about the 1924 Everest expedition, potentially even being Mallory's own camera, whose existence could even conclude the mystery on whether Mallory or Irvine ever reached the summit. This introduction is great. We learn about a truly notable undertaking in the history of mountaineering, getting an intriguing question in the process, and the answer is potentially found in a shady, second-hand store. The dynamic of this heroic journey's sole record winding up in a second-hand store, which sells the gear of previous failed expeditions, helps introduce us to the realistic tone of the story. Nothing is sacred. Fukamachi's own pathetic realness also helps introduce us to the story's moods and themes, especially the great, realistic feel possessed in the manga. Upon purchasing the camera, after haggling with the store's owner, Fukamachi now has a temporarily revived passion in his search for the historic truth. Fukamachi first begins analyzing the validity that the camera is the model Mallory used by contacting a colleague in Japan, and upon receiving some confirmation, Fukamachi decides to further his research by talking to the seller about who previously owned the camera, prolonging his stay in Kathmandu. Fukamachi is very out of place in Kathmandu, shown by his trust of shady people and his lack of touch with the poor locals, and it really helps to visualize Fukamachi's own loneliness. The journey Fukamachi takes into tracking the camera's history takes up a good half of the story, and while it is very exposition heavy, it helps naturally introduce us to Kathmandu and to Habu, the secondary protagonist / lead of the story, who previously owned the camera and whose sight evokes a new interest for Fukamachi. As Fukamachi's own investigation into Habu continues, he decides to return to Japan and interview past colleagues of Habu. These interviews not only add a natural way for exposition, which in interesting biographical-like stories tell of Habu's journey into becoming the legendary, hidden figure of climbing that he is, but it also mythologizes him. The grand tales of Habu really testing himself on the mountains, which he sees as his home, is greatly entertaining to learn about, especially with how it compares to what we and Fukamachi first discover him as in Kathmandu. Habu is a self-dependent man, not because he's a loner that hates others, but because not many others are willing to dedicate their life to climbing like he has. For most, climbing is a pastime activity to enjoy on the weekends or vacations, but Habu's life is climbing. He's fully dedicated his life to mountaineering, even to the point of living in the cheapest room he can find and working as little as he can so that he can focus on planning his next climb. This dedicatedness that Habu has in his life is something that Fukamachi respects and envies, leading him to seek Habu out. One of the things that differentiates Fukamachi and Habu the most is Habu's persistence and Habu's belief in himself. Through these interviews, we learn about Habu's many failures, yet he always returns to the mountains. For Fukamachi, the mountains were just a temporary escape from his everyday life, a hobby that's thoughts disappears once he succeeds or fails. But for Habu, it's his life's work. Through struggle and success, it's all the same, as Habu will still climb until he dies. Although Habu still seeks to live so that he can continue climbing. This focus on living that we see Habu develop through these interviews is fascinating. For Habu, Being alive is important, but surviving isn't the same thing as living, something that Habu finds when he's climbing. It's a great dynamic, his natural urge for this dangerous life, but also the fight to live and sustain such life. Through these interviews, it also draws a large gap between Habu's past and his current present, his current motives being shrouded in mystery. There's also a real sense of distance between Fukamachi and Habu, which we also feel, not only in that his current whereabouts are unknown, but also why he would leave to Kathmandu. His distance is also exemplified with how we only hear third-person accounts of Habu, not any from the man himself. We don't have any accounts of his current motivation. But as Fukamachi learns more about Habu, this distance starts to close, and Fukamachi comes to respect him more and more. We can really feel how much Fukamachi is throwing himself into his research, mostly because of his hope of finding some passion to rekindle his unfulfilling and disappointment-filled life, just like what led him to embark on his failed Everest mission. We also relate to Fukamachi's feelings of being lost, as the plot has many red herrings and mysteries about Habu that leads to failed pursuits. Fukamachi's character starts as very empty, very surface level. His sole purpose is to investigate, but through his trials and conflicts along the way, we could see a more emotional and compelling character, whose journey and motivation in unraveling the hidden history of mountaineering is grand. Most of Fukamachi's flaws come from his unbelief in himself, making him non-committal in his endeavors, which is tested as the investigation becomes less straightforward, forcing him to confront his view of himself, and not give in to his impulsive want to abandon the search. We also learn more about his reasons for traveling to Everest in the beginning, which helps contextualize his past and future journey. Fukamachi's journalistic nature is great for the story. It naturally leads him and us to question things, but it also makes his relationship with Habu interesting. His job isn't to pry too deeply into Habu's life, or to bother him, but sometimes that's the only way to achieve his information. A lot of conflicts start to appear as Fukamachi tries to research people who don't want to be known themselves, and he's forced to question if this investigation is really ethical, especially as we learn more about how the history of Mount Everest's mountaineering has led to many problems for the locals, and how many times their customs are broken by these foreign explorers. When we finally do see Habu again, our questions aren't immediately answered. Rather, his secretive nature leads to only vague answers. But his secrecy now makes sense, as we've learned of the many traumatic events he's experienced. Yet his motivation in Kathmandu can still only be guessed at. I love how the plot is affected when we meet Habu. When we see him, he still retains that mythical sheen that's been given to him from his great feats we've learned of alongside Fukamachi. He still remains this mysterious figure. But when we finally meet him, we slowly learn more about him, as he becomes more trusting and vulnerable, as he learns that Fukamachi genuinely cares about him and climbing. Of course, this doesn't happen in a rushed manner. It unfolds in a slow, more impactful pace, and yet it still holds a great intrigue that advances the plot, especially with the question of how Habu relates to the Ascent that opened the manga. As I learned more about his character, the realness of him only served to emphasize his greatness. I think Habu's obsession with climbing comes from the fact that he's lost so many people in life, and yet the mountains are there. No matter what happens in his life, the mountains will still call for his ascent, for his struggle to reach its summit. As long as he still lives, he will surely continue moving, even though he suffered so much. We can truly feel his life's work and passion, his victories, losses, and sacrifices for climbing, which makes his very human character feel extraordinary. Habu really represents the idea that some people never really want to leave the mountains. The world of mountaineering is greatly explored in this manga. We see the many types of climbers, those who climb recreationally and those who climb professionally that seek glory. We get a brief look of the challengers that took to themselves to experience and conquer the most difficult challenges, like climbing grand mountains alone in winter, along with the passion and competitiveness that filled these people's souls. Through Fukamachi's investigation into Habu, we learn more about the mountaineering scene, but recently it has declined, seeing as not too many challenges remain. Habu is one of the last mountaineers truly challenging himself, which adds to this theme of a dying frontier in climbing. The fact that Habu isn't doing this for money or for fame just goes to show how truly passionate he is. Mountains also have their own characters themselves, whether it's their unique formations that differentiates them from others, their different heights, or their skill required to climb. These features are greatly shown in the art of this manga, with its great textural work that shows the rough, rocky terrain and the powdery, unstable snow and ice. We are also shown the detailed paths and routes that surround these behemoth mountains, the footsteps that our characters take, the way the mountains fall apart with rockfall adds so much tension to the climbs in the manga, showing how many quick decisions our characters have to make on the mount. A returning motif is the harsh and wrath-like sound of the blistering and rushing wind, adding to the unsettling tone and tension of the elevation. The danger of climbing is intensely conveyed in this manga, which only adds to the picture struggle our characters face. These climbs are trials that can last days, making slow and energy-sapping progress, as just in an instant, if you're not careful, you could lose your footing and die. And we really get to see the flow of time in the quickly changing weather, which progresses through the climb. The climbing gear the climbers use is greatly detailed as well, and we learn more about the functions of each piece and how much they depend on them, how the pitons and crampons add a little relief in the form of stability. The detail and realism of the art is also shown on the skin of our characters, whether it's their intense sweating that emphasize their exhaustion, the suffering tiredness captured in their sunken eyes, and the desperate gasps for oxygen, which is just a cold mist in the air. We can always tell what our characters are feeling, and not just by their facial expressions. This show of exhaustion greatly creates tension, as there's no way for them to rest unless they can conquer the mountain and their own bodily weaknesses. These tense trials only serve to add so much triumph to the story when we finally see our characters reach their summit. The story's elements of a man attempting to reach ever-growing heights so that they can find a reason to live, no matter how cruel nature can be. It's powerfully used in this story. And as the story reaches its final third, we see Fukamachi work with Habu on the mount. It's great to see Fukamachi, not quite an amateur in climbing, but definitely not the most proficient, work with Habu, a man who's both powerful and skilled, yet is starting to show his age. It's great because we see Habu shown to his fullest potential after being told of his beginnings, and seeing Fukamachi develop in real time throughout the story into becoming a more progressive person in his own life's journey. These are two men at different periods in their lives, working to accomplish the same goal. It's great to see how Fukamachi re-enlivens Habu with his presence. There's finally someone willing to dedicate so much time to climbing, like Habu. Someone Habu can be partnered with after so long. And it's great to see how Fukamachi learns more and more from Habu about believing in yourself and following your passion and dream to its end, no matter how bitter or sweet it may be. Ultimately, the story just revolves around one man, possibly still in his prime, attempting to conquer a challenge he's had, one nature has almost designed for him in mind, and another man's attempt to document it. It's in the realism and lifelike quality that this story has that makes it so grand and intimate. I came to love Fukamachi and Habu and their relationship because of how real they were. We saw their patheticness and weaknesses, and that's what makes both of their resolve so powerful. We see them at their lowest, and we see them at their highest. No matter what obstacle, they got back up and proved their suffering was valuable. It's a very passionate story, and I think the realism we see in the world, in the conflict, and in our two lead characters make it all the more perfect. In my opinion, this story is another 10 out of 10.